Okay, what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is give a very rough and ready brief discussion about legitimation code theory, a few aspects of legitimation code theory. As I said, it's very rough and ready. I'm really giving this to help a colleague who is not familiar with legitimation code theory have a sort of crash course into a couple of the concepts before she reads further, because she is co-supervising with me with someone who is using legitimation code theory. So these are my crib notes about legitimation code theory for that colleague. Hey Tando, but I thought I may as well record it because I might possibly pass this along to some other students who are starting out with the possibility of using legitimation code theory. And I found often it's helpful when you enter a new theoretical realm to get the kind of crib notes. It's not good enough. It doesn't give you the nuance and the sophistication that the theory gives you, but it does give you something to start with. So I think, first of all, is to look at the actual term, legitimation code theory. So the idea of theory as a set of lenses that allow us to see the world in different ways, explanations, tools that can move us beyond everyday understandings. So that's the theory part of legitimation code theory. Code. Well, this is based on the idea that a lot of our practices in higher education and any social practices really are coded, and a lot of the values and the expectations are not made explicit. And this is part of the social justice aspect of legitimation code theory, this understanding that these codes shouldn't be mysterious. They should be made explicit so that people can access them and can critique them. And this draws largely from the work of Bourdieu in this regard. Legitimation code theory has been developed by Carl Mayton, and the book Knowledge and Knowers and various other books in the series published by Routledge have expanded on legitimation code theory. But the roots are the work of Bernstein and Bourdieu. And they definitely are concerned with the coded nature of social experience. So that's code theory. Then the legitimation of legitimation code theory. And this shows you that the focus here is on what it is that gets legitimated in various social practices, and how that process happens. How is it that some things are considered legitimate and valid and worthy and other things are not? So there you have it, legitimation code theory. The legitimation code theory has a number of tools that it offers us that we can use to analyze data in any form, in order to ask questions around legitimation code theory. What gets legitimated and coded in our social practices? I'm going to talk very quickly about just two of those tools in the legitimation code theory toolbox, and that is specialization and semantics. So specialization really asks, what is it that specializes a particular discipline or field? What makes it what it is and therefore different to other disciplines or fields? And so it provides us with some tools to analyze the nature of its specialization. So I think if we consider from the point of view of analysing data in higher education studies, I think we're all very aware of the role of education in reinforcing unjust status quo in society. So I think there's a lot of research that looks at how the injustices of society get reinforced by the complicity of higher education, but the research is often quite blind to how this happens. How is it that universities are unjust, and how is it that they reinforce these broader social injustices? I think it's also often quite blind, the research into this is often quite blind about the idea that knowledge differs from discipline to discipline, and it brings with it its own structures, that knowledge in itself is a value system and legitimates certain ways of doing things in certain forms. And so specialization is a tool in the legitimation code theory toolbox, which allows us to analyze data in order to understand how it is that this specialization happens. So it takes as its premise this understanding that while there's always knowledge, there's also always knowers. So in other words, in any area in life, but let's think about it in the academy, in any discipline or field, there's a body of knowledge which is valued in that field or discipline. But there's also a set of knowers that are valued. And that's important. Regardless of the discipline or field, there's always both knowledge and knowers. And the knowers are those that are considered legitimate. Those people whose behaviors or views or dispositions or gazes or ways of being, however we want to say it, identify them as being members of that discipline or field. So the knowers are not necessarily the students. The students are perhaps you might want to consider the novice knowers. They're trying to become legitimate members of the field. It's not necessarily even the lecturer. Some lecturers might be very well established and recognized in the field as appropriate knowers, but others might not be yet, but they're still teaching the field. So there's always knowledge and there's always knowers, but the form, the structure of that knowledge and the structure of those knowers varies extensively across different disciplines and fields. So specialization provides the tools that allow us to identify what is the structure of the knowledge in that particular discipline or field, what is the kind of knower that is legitimated in that particular discipline or field. And therefore, it allows us to make the implicit explicit. It allows us to make the value system in a field explicit, because I think there is sometimes the notion that some fields are neutral, that knowledge is built in a very neutral, technical way, and that there is no value system or politics involved. And specialization, the tool of specialization, allows us to make very explicit the fact that, of course, every discipline and field brings with it a value system. And it allows us then to teach in ways that make that value system more explicit and therefore make it hopefully easier for people to access it when the rules are made clear. But it also makes it possible for them to challenge it. You can't challenge what's invisible. So I'm trying to find where I wrote my next page, because I did scribble some notes before starting this. So let's just think. So in specialization, it allows us to map our data, whatever form that data might be, a curriculum document, an interview, whatever. It allows us to map our data along two separate continuums. So the first continuum is epistemic relations, ER, which is about the knowledge. And like any continuums, there's a stronger and stronger and stronger side and a weaker and weaker and weaker side. And you can map your data anywhere along the degree of strength of epistemic relations. And the epistemic relations is about relations to the object of the discipline or field, the knowledge. To what extent is a particular set of knowledge, skills, and practices very strongly valued? Is it all important about being able to know in particular ways? Is that knowledge very strongly bounded? It's very clear rules about what is knowledge in the field and what doesn't belong in the field, and how that knowledge is constructed in the field. As I say, I'm giving you the crude version of this. There's more nuance, but you can map. Is this very strong? Is this particular discipline or this particular piece of data, is it all about the knowledge, skills, and practices very, very strong? Or is that kind of weak? We're not that concerned about knowledge, skills, and practices, or somewhere in between, because like any continuum, there's a million places along that road you could put a dot. And then the second continuum is what we call social relations. And social relations is about the relationship between if epistemic relations is a relation to the object of knowledge, social relations is to the subject of knowledge. So this is about the knower. To what extent, on the very, very strong side, is it all about that you have to have a particular gaze, disposition, way of being? Is that all important to succeed? You need to be this kind of knower. Or is that less important? Can kind of anybody hack it? We don't expect you to be a particular kind of person, to have a particular disposition, a way of being in the world, that in fact anyone, you can have whatever religion, viewpoints, political views, you can hold any theories about the world, and you can still succeed? In other words, it's very weak social relations, or is it all about being a kind of person and demonstrating that disposition? So it's all about very strong social relations. So by figuring out the strengths of the ER, the epistemic relations, we can weaker and stronger, and by figuring out the strength and weakness of the social relations, we can plot on these two continua. But we can then intersect these two continua so that we actually get a Cartesian plane where we can map both the epistemic relations and the social relations. And this allows us, it's very important though, once we do a Cartesian plane, that we don't suddenly think, oh, there's 4 separate types, because even within each quadrant, there's a million different possibilities of stronger and weaker. We could even put it between the boundaries of various quadrants. But nonetheless, I think it is helpful to think about the intersection between epistemic relations and social relations in a Cartesian plane to allow us to make sense of what specializes knowledge. And that allows us to talk broadly in terms of 4 codes. The knowledge, the knower, the elite, and the relativist. So this allows us to make sense of what is being most valued. And we can then code multiple data on this, and we can find code clashes, we can find code shifts. For example, if I think of Jackie Look's PhD thesis, she showed a code clash between what people said they wanted a curriculum, it was public management curriculum, and what people said they wanted the curriculum to do, which was very much a knower code, where it wasn't so important. There's always knowledge, there's always some basic knowledge to have, but it was much more knower code, which was all about, we want our graduates to have a certain disposition, to have a very social justice disposition, to be very concerned with serving the public. Very knower code. But then when she looked at the curriculum, it was more knowledge code. It was all the emphasis in the content and in the assessment of the curriculum was about learning lots and lots of theories and facts and statistics around public management as a field. So she could argue that there was this code clash. And if we look at Tandeka Mkhize's PhD, she also used specialization, and she was looking at accounting. And she showed a code clash between the fact that it's very much a knowledge code, accounting. It doesn't matter what kind of person you are. You can dress how you like. You can have whatever views you are. Very weak social relations, but very strong epistemic relations. You need to know the knowledge, and knowledge builds on knowledge. So it's a lot of knowledge, and you need to learn it sequentially in accounting. But she could again show that there was a bit of a code clash then in what the students needed and in what the curriculum offered. So you can see examples there of how the specialization helps us to articulate what it is that's valued in the data. And it can also help us to critique disciplines or data. I keep jumping between disciplines and data because some of you might not be, some people might not be analyzing disciplines. You can code almost anything along the specialization, using the specialization tool. And we can also code at a kind of a fractal level. What I mean by that is you could code 50 policies, and for each one just code what is the most dominant, because of course it's not going to be that every bit of a document is only in one code, but which is dominant. So you could code 50 documents for, let's say, 50 curriculum documents on continuum, or you could just take one and code each paragraph or code each sentence or code each word even. So you can choose whether to code at that very microscopic level or at the bigger level. So that very roughly is about specialization. But there's lots more, of course. You can look at insights and gazes to look more specifically at what form the epistemic relations take or the social relations take. But that's enough for now. So let me move briskly along to the second tool that I'm going to talk about, which is the semantics tool. And this tool, as the name suggests, allows us to code the way in which meaning is made. It allows us to make sense of the form of meaning making that is legitimated in the data. And again, we've got two continua that you can code against: semantic gravity and semantic density. Let me start with semantic density. Semantic density is about how dense these ideas are in terms of being condensed into symbols and phrases and terminology and so on. So some disciplines have got very weak semantic density. They use mostly ordinary everyday language, and they use it in a way that can make sense to anyone. You could use a dictionary and take word by word and hopefully kind of make sense of what the knowledge is that's being made. But then there are other disciplines that have got very strong semantic density, and those are ones where a single word is could take a whole book to explain what that word means, and people who are knowers in the field will bring that knowledge to the word, but those that are not yet knowers, that novice students won't know that word has all sorts of baggage, it carries all sorts of meaning. And some disciplines have much more stronger semantic density than others. So for example, if I say to you E equals MC squared, chances are you just know, well, you don't necessarily, most of us don't understand actually what that means. We can say E equals MC squared, but we don't understand. To actually understand E equals MC squared, even understanding what E means, equals means, M means, C means, and what the idea of squaring something means, even if we understood all those parts, we still wouldn't understand what E equals MC squared is, because it's cumulative. You would need to have all the foundational concepts from which that formula came. So E equals MC squared is an example of incredibly strong semantic density. And that means that you really have to be an insider to make sense of it. But often our students misidentify the density in words, especially in fields like higher education studies, where unfortunately a lot of our words are exactly the same words as are used in ordinary everyday English. So for example, the word argument. Now, I'm not suggesting that's as semantically dense as E equals MC squared, but the word argument I expect it to bring a whole lot of meaning that is not found in the dictionary when you look up the word argument. I mean, in our field, argument means understanding this sort of negotiated debates around a particular position. Argument means being able to express a position through the use of claims and evidence, and so on and so forth. Argument means a particular relationship to prior research. When I use the word argument, when I say to a student, your argument needs to be strengthened here, I'm expecting all of that to be brought into the room, and students aren't able necessarily to unpack that meaning, and so they might get confused. So I'm not going to go into more detail with that, but hopefully you've got a sense that that's what semantic density is all about. Then so you can code on semantic density. Then you can code on semantic gravity. Semantic gravity is the extent to which the argument or knowledge or whatever form your data is related to a particular context, and it belongs in that context. And that is strong semantic gravity. Just think of the notion of gravity. If something's very strong, it's stuck down on the earth. If something has very weak gravity, it floats off. So think of gravity as being down here. Strong semantic gravity is when you make your argument or you make your position based on this context, and it's only true for this context, and you spend a lot of time explaining this context. Whereas weaker semantic gravity is when it's more abstracted, where what you're saying is more about principles that can refer to multiple contexts, that can shift across contexts. That would be weaker semantic gravity. And again, we can plot semantic gravity and semantic density on a Cartesian plane, but we can also look at especially semantic gravity, in terms of waves. Sometimes people plot the waves of semantic gravity and semantic density at the same time. Sometimes they plot the waves just of semantic gravity. And so if we think of pedagogy, good pedagogy takes the form of waves, where we go from students' understanding and context and the reality of students' prior knowledge, and then takes them more abstracted to the field, and then brings it back down to an example in theirs and takes it back up, and so on. A PhD thesis should have waves. where it takes it from the context of where the study's taking place, but then it abstracts it because you want your PhD to have findings and contributions that are beyond that particular classroom where you collected your data, that would be of interest to readers in other contexts, other universities, other systems, other countries. So you need to be able to contextualize your study, but then show how that context allows you to reach findings that speak to principles and theories more broadly and back down and so on. So that, in a very rushed way, is specialization and semantics. And I'm thinking that that will be useful to you as we embark on co-supervising a student. I'm talking to Tando again here, where you bring the disciplinary expertise that I severely lack, but where hopefully I can bring some of the knowledge of the tools that our student will be using. And I look forward to further conversation.